Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar presentation today by ESS BIZTOOLS in conjunction with our affiliates. This is the COVID-19 Survival Panel, session number 14. Today I have with me Matthew Karakalakis from AMK Law in Adelaide and Melbourne. How are you, Matthew?
Very well, thank you, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here on live social media and connecting with people.
Very good. And I understand you're in Adelaide and it's a bit cool today, is it?
It is a bit cold, but I'm very happy to be here in Adelaide, especially considering Melbourne have gone into their second lockdown.
Yes, that's right. And we also have Trent Butler, who's from Trent Butler Consulting Services in Sydney. How are you today, Trent?
Well, thanks, Peter. Thanks for having me again. Really
right.
Nice to be here.
Very good to have you. And is it cold in Sydney today?
Yeah, it is. It is.
Oh,
A few hot coffees are needed today.
And I'm in Townsville, and Townsville had 8 or 9 degrees this morning. I think that was nearly as bad as Sydney. So it's a cold snap going right around Australia by the sounds.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get rolling then. So also a great welcome to our live viewers on Facebook and to people watching this as a live webinar. Welcome, and I hope that you get information as accountants or business advisors or bookkeepers, which will help you in your business. The presenters, as I've said, is Matthew Karakalakis, AMK Law, Adelaide and Melbourne, and Trent Butler from Trent Butler Consulting in Sydney. I'm the host, and if you have any questions, can you please type your question into chat if you're watching this as a live webinar. If you're watching on Facebook Live, you can't access our website direct or our broadcast site direct. So can you send us an email and I will pass the questions on to Trent or Matthew and get the reply back to you. And we will put the question and the answer on our Facebook page. The email's peter@essbiztools.com.au. I now want to introduce you to Matthew Karakalakis. Matthew is a solicitor. I've known Matthew for a few years now. He's done a very important project for me a couple of years ago, and he's a very experienced legal practitioner. Good afternoon, Matthew. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Peter. It's thanks for that introduction. And as I say, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very much looking forward to speaking about effective dispute resolution in Australia, particularly in this period of COVID-19.
Okay, Matthew, you're on live, so you can proceed.
Here we go. Okay. So first of all, as we're going, I'd like to just first give our acknowledgement to the traditional owners of the land in which we are in today and pay respects to our Indigenous elders past, present and future. Now, what we are going to do in this presentation today is speak about litigation, the processes, and then also the impacts of COVID-19 and the way that courts are doing things in this particular period of the pandemic. First of all, it's, I think, important to understand in all times, litigation itself needs to be viewed as being a last resort. It's really important to understand that litigation is a very expensive process, and if mechanisms can be used and implemented, if the right steps can be taken, hopefully parties can avoid going to court in the first place. So, if you have a dispute, have a look and consider what are the steps that you have taken and the steps that you can take to try and resolve your dispute. And be aware of the resources and tools that are available to try and resolve your matter outside of the courts. Because there are non-litigious forms of dispute resolution, and I'm going to be covering some of those with you in a moment. If you're involved in a dispute, ask yourself, have you been able to resolve issues, or have they unnecessarily escalated through internal channels. Sometimes, for example, by dealing with senior mentors or people within an organisation, in management, for example, matters can be resolved. Because remember, court cases are always expensive, time-consuming, and if possible, should be avoided by resolving the dispute in other ways. So some of the very efficient and effective alternative dispute resolution processes that you can keep in mind that might be available for you are these. First of all, negotiation. So negotiation itself is a very cost-effective, outcome-based approach that can involve the different parties to the dispute communicating with the effort and objective of resolving the matters. Negotiation can sometimes include lawyers, but doesn't need to. Negotiation can be done via a representative, or you can negotiate yourself. Another form of alternative dispute resolution is mediation. So mediation itself, I'm sure a lot of people are aware of. And what's interesting about mediation is it can happen before a court process, and mediation can even happen as a part of the court process. In a mediation, it's a matter of having confidential discussions in a formal process, and it involves an actual mediator. Make sure if you're involved in a mediator, that's before a court process takes place, that the mediator themselves are accredited. Mediations can include lawyers, they can include representatives. These days, in the midst of COVID-19, there's a lot of mediations that are actually taking place online. So while mediation itself is voluntary, it can also be ordered by the court if the proceedings are on foot. So just remember that. The mediator themselves, they're independent. So their objective is to assist the parties trying to resolve the dispute, but they do not make any binding decisions. Any outcome from a mediation is reached by the parties by agreement. What that also can mean is parties can go to a mediation and then end up without actually having an agreement at the end of the mediation. Still though, most cases do resolve, and even if there's no agreement at the end of the mediation, all those discussions that have taken place can then help reach an agreement soon thereafter. That's happened many times in my experience, but again, it doesn't always happen. Then we've got arbitration. Arbitration itself can be legally binding in some instances. You have a person who's appointed as the arbitrator. Again, they're not a judge, but they do have the power in some instances to impose binding decisions. And there's a formal process. Arbitration itself can even be considered as sort of like a midpoint between a mediation and a court, where yes, it's more formal than mediation, and yes, the arbitrator has a bit more power than what a mediator does, but the arbitration itself is not as complex, is not as process driven, and is not as rigid in terms of rules, dissimilar to the court process. Now, the arbitrator themselves can be engaged and appointed by agreement between the parties. And the purpose of the arbitrator, their role is to try and resolve the dispute. So a good thing to keep in mind is implement these mechanisms before going to court, and particularly in this current pandemic period. There's been a lot of clients who have come to us here at AMK Law, and they've been asking, how quickly can their matter be resolved? That's a difficult question to answer at the best of times, because whilst most cases actually settle, that can assist in ordinary times in knowing that cases will normally be determined before the end of a trial or even before a trial date. But in this current pandemic period, things are being a lot more slow in terms of court processes. So what that means is focusing here and now on these alternative dispute resolution mechanisms are imperative to enable effective resolution of matters. We have to now, in this current pandemic period, rely upon these alternative mechanisms for the efficiencies involved, now more than ever. That said, and with this understanding about the alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, we still do have litigation. These are the legal proceedings. These are the proceedings that are commenced in court. 90% of the time, I think that those proceedings would involve lawyers, because court documents need to be prepared. There's complexities in preparing those documents. If documents aren't prepared according to court rules, for example, they won't even be accepted. And having court processes and court documents prepared in ways that are inconsistent with the rules can result in cases being lost that otherwise should be won. So, the first thing in the court process is actually having the court documents written, whether it be by application, originating motion, statement of claim, points of claim depending on jurisdiction. The point is though, merely having a matter brought into the court does not mean that the matter is going to be determined by a judge, because remember, most cases do settle. And so what I'd like to do is give you some of the key steps and some of the key considerations in the court process itself. So litigation, and I'm talking about civil litigation here in particular, because I don't do any criminal law. Our focus at AMK Law is in the commercial and litigation space. So I'm really talking about the civil litigation disputes. Now, in the civil litigation disputes, you have two or more entities that are involved in the dispute. And these entities could be natural people, they could be companies, they could be trust entities, partnerships, but at the end of the day, they involve disputes between two or more legal entities, and the steps of the court process need to be followed. So one of the very first considerations when deciding that your case has to go to court is, what jurisdiction are you going to take your case to? There's a number of factors there. One of those factors is, where did the dispute actually occur? So in a contract scenario, for example, there's a need to understand where exactly was the contract formed, where exactly did the breach of legal duties occur, and those can point to the right jurisdiction in terms of the state. Or even sometimes these days, you can even be looking at jurisdiction in terms of countries, particularly because a lot of transactions in a contract sense take place online. Once you've understood the location, you can then start looking at which court has the right power, and also which court will be most cost effective. And another important factor in jurisdiction is which court will be able to determine this matter as efficiently as possible. Sometimes the lower jurisdiction court, say the Magistrate Court in Victoria, will determine cases a lot quicker than the higher jurisdiction court of, say, the Supreme Court. So once understanding those factors, it's then a matter of filing the court documentation and setting off in the case. The person that sets off and initiates by filing that first document is generally termed the plaintiff, or sometimes applicant. So once that's happened, there's an obligation on the defendant to file a defence. In the defence itself, there is a need for each of the points that are set out in the claim to be formally responded to. And generally in a defence, the key points will be disputed. And there's some points of the claim itself, for example, some of the background type matters that can be accepted without argument. That can lead to certain deficiencies. But it's really important when preparing a defence to understand exactly the key parts of the claim that you actually do disagree with, and then respond to those accordingly. Another thing that can happen at the time of filing a defence is a defendant can make counterclaims. So for example, let's look at this type of scenario. Just say you've got a contract that's been made and the plaintiff makes an application saying Joe Bloggs has to pay $1,000 under this contract. What Joe Bloggs might do in a counterclaim is say, yes, but as a result of the plaintiff not complying with their obligations, they weren't able to make certain sales, and so they lost $3,000. That's a simple example of a type of counterclaim that could then be made. Also, if you're a defendant in an action, make sure you know your time requirements. Sometimes what can happen is defendants can miss certain dates, not file their defense in time, and then automatic or summary judgment can be made against the defendant. So make sure you understand the times in which you need to respond to that claim. Now, throughout the court process, there's some key things that happen. One of those key components is called discovery. That's essentially where the parties themselves have to hand over. They've got a legal obligation, a very heavy, onerous legal obligation, which is set out by a whole heap of laws, including court rules. And it says that parties have to disclose, effectively hand over documents that are in their possession, custody, and control. I think some of you might be aware of the old TV shows or horror stories. I know myself, certainly as a younger lawyer, we were very aware of days and days being tucked away in rooms with boxes full of documents. Luckily, those types of days now seem to have been gone, because discovery itself generally is about electronic documents, because these days most documents are available electronically. So it's a lot easier in terms of the process, not having to physically handle documents. But that said, there is still some instances in where there are physical hard documents that need to be compiled and gone through in that discovery process. At our firm, we use a lot of fantastic technology, and the discovery process becomes way more efficient, but there's still some other places where the more traditional type practices take place. One thing to remember though is sometimes parties might have a document they don't want to hand over. The obligation though is very strict. Any document that's relevant has to be handed over. Now, a couple of other considerations that I just want to touch on briefly is the witness component. So witnesses can come in different forms depending on the type of case, but a common occurrence is for expert witnesses to be engaged. So for example, in a current case we have on at the moment, it involves a dispute over a motor vehicle. Now we're saying the vehicle has damage, but the damage to the vehicle is not our fault. There's three parties to the case, and they're also each trying to deny responsibility and trying to deny liability. As a result, we're engaging an expert mechanical engineer to then be able to pinpoint the basis, and we can use that expert evidence to determine the liability on that factual expert basis, and then we can apply the applicable laws. That's an example of how expert witnesses come into play. Now, these are just some of the points to consider in the litigation process. If anyone's going to court or wants to ask any more questions about these kind of things, feel free to reach out after this presentation. What I'd like to also be able to explain and give some heads up on for those listening to this presentation today is the way that Australian courts and tribunals are dealing with the differences that have been imposed during COVID-19 are actually, in my view, quite significant. And I also think that some of these changes are fantastic in terms of efficiencies. So what do I mean by the fantastic changes? Well, there's a lot of court hearings now that have been taken by telephone, video conferences, online software such as Zoom and the like. I think that's great. I think it's fantastic that we can have these types of efficiencies. There's a lot of inefficiencies though. The inefficiencies include a lot of courts now are not actually taking documents over the counter. There's a lot of hearings that have been postponed. The court processes themselves and trial dates in particular have generally been pushed back. And also it means that the written documentation and physical hard evidence that is very helpful in some cases. For example, you would have seen TV shows or perhaps been involved in a case where you've seen a particular apparatus, tool or physical object be handed to a judge. That can sometimes really help in a case. Obviously, with online software, that's not possible. So some of those physical components that were once relied upon are no longer there during this particular COVID-19 period. Overall though, in summary, I'd really like to say it's important, if you're involved in a legal dispute, to get advice as soon as you possibly can. The foundations of a legal matter can sometimes be the very basis for getting the best result overall and empowering you in your legal position. Remember the significant alternative dispute resolution mechanisms that are available, and use them, particularly during this current global pandemic, because they can deliver the most cost-effective, most efficient, and most timely results in a lot of instances. Remember, courts and tribunals are still doing the best they can. If you're involved in a court or tribunal matter, be patient. Things are still moving along, even though they're taking a little longer than normal. I'd like to say thank you everybody for listening to this presentation today, and I wish you all a very, very fantastic day and all the very best in your legal matters.
Sorry, Peter, just to jump in, mate. I think you're on mute, if you can hear me.
Hi, Peter. Can you hear me at the moment?
Yeah,
Peter?
I can now. Sorry, I was on mute and I'd forgotten that I'd put myself on mute.
No problem.
Thanks, Trent.
You're right.
Matthew, just to follow up with a question then for you on the mediation process. If a court has ordered mediation, does that mean that the result of the mediation, even if the mediator has made a decision, has that got to go back to the court for ratification by the judge?
The short answer in that is no, but there are just a couple of points I'd love to add to provide deeper context to that answer. So if a court orders a mediation, the confidentiality components and the parties' abilities to negotiate outcomes they're happy with, and also the role of the mediator, is exactly as I was explaining earlier. The point to remember though is, if a case is settled at mediation, then the mediator themselves does then go and report to the court, but only insofar as saying the case has now been resolved.
Oh, okay, right.
And the other thing that needs to happen is, if a case is before the court and settles, the case then needs to properly be removed from the court in accordance with the court rules. And that's really by way of the parties preparing orders and having them signed, just really saying that the case is no longer in the court, and it's a very simple document, but that's a formality that needs to be complied with.
Thanks, Matthew. And one other question that I've got from an accountant who had asked me to raise this: is there enough appreciation by practicing accountants of the legal process to advise their clients to talk to a solicitor as early as possible in the process? Do you think there should be more reaction by accountants to encourage their clients to go and talk to people like you, to the legal profession, to get some matters sorted out, or do they tend to let them sit there and fester and build into a bigger problem because they've let it roll around for a year or 2 years, and then suddenly everyone's getting upset and there's got more money involved?
I really appreciate that question, Peter, and I have a view in this based on experience, and that view is that there's a role for accountants and a role for lawyers, and there's strengths and weaknesses in both. I think that the sooner people are able to get the legal advice they need, the better off they'll be. That definitely applies in the dispute context. So for example, if clients come to me earlier in the process and say, hey, look, I've got this going on, the advice I normally give is, hey, let's try and resolve this as efficiently as we possibly can. And then I'll start pointing to things like mediation, alternative dispute resolution, or even, for example, we've got a matter going on now that luckily the client came to see me from the very beginning, and we've been able to resolve this matter through emails and just discussions. Now, there's instances just like that one where clients haven't got the legal advice soon enough. They've found themselves involved in a court case where costs get extremely expensive. It's way more stressful, and it could have been avoided by getting that legal advice earlier on. The other thing I'd love to add in light of that is, I think that even in terms of, see, if you look at a lot of commercial disputes, they can often happen as a result of agreements or commercial transactions or structuring things and the like. And there's a lot of accountants who have got some really great software that can generate shareholders agreements, trust deeds, and things like that. I've had quite a few instances where clients have had those kind of documents generated through the accountant's automatic software. And then problems have come about, and the agreement that they thought the accountant had created was actually faulty in many, many regards. That then created a whole heap of problems, including for the accountant. The accountant then, in a couple of those instances, was blamed upon by the client, even though the accountant was trying to do a favour for the client and just trying to save some legal costs, because those sort of things can sometimes be cheaper through the accountant. But there's definitely significant accounting risk on those type of documents. Also, when problems strike, if you've got things in place properly from the very beginning, problems can be dealt with much easier. So I bring the answer to this question right back to the very beginning and say, I think lawyers should even be the ones that generate those documents, because I think it makes it safer for accountants, better for parties overall as well. Likewise, if I have a client that comes to me for sort of, financial or accounting type concerns, I will refer them to an accountant straight away, because I know that they'll do a way better job than I can.
Okay. Righto. Well, thank you very much for that, Matthew. Did you have any questions of Matthew, Trent?
Just one, Peter, if I can, just really quickly. You speak of alternative dispute resolution, Matthew, and my understanding certainly is that that's not not necessarily a really traditional route for lawyers, where a lot of lawyers seem to be direct to the adversarial approach. So it's great to hear you're taking that other route with clients. Is that a trend you've seen sort of ramp up over time in the legal profession, or has it always been there and I just haven't been aware of it? Or maybe if you can just comment on that. Sure.
Trent, that's a good question. We recently won an innovation award. It's very well regarded in legal circles.
Great, congrats.
Thank you very much. And I think one of the reasons for that is the culture that we have within our team. And part of that culture is really about efficiencies and actually having that value-driven outcome approach to all of our legal matters. So there's some traditional law firms that look only at sort of, this straight line approach, let's go to court because that's what we do in all our matters. But what we do is have a good look and see, what is this all about? What does our client want to achieve? And most of the time in legal disputes, people want to achieve an efficient outcome that's fair. And so in the context of those scenarios, dispute resolution and ADR mechanisms can be extremely effective.
Yeah, great.
Okay, thank you very much, Matthew. We're now going to move on and introduce you to Trent. We'll just go back and so we can do all that properly. So Trent Butler is an accountant, as you've heard, but he's also a marketing and social media expert. So Trent Butler from Trent Butler Consulting in Sydney is now going to give us an overview of 7 steps to marketing success for a professional services business in a COVID-19 environment. Welcome, Trent, and it's over to you.
Great to be here, Peter. Thank you once again for having me. And I've got some big shoes to fill following Matthew's very well coherent and spoken presentation. So I'll do my best. Just to check, guys, is my screen and slides and voice coming through okay?
Yes, thanks. Yeah.
All right, great. Well, yeah, I think you said 7 steps. I've cut it down to 5.
Oh, okay.
And really, I want to spend most of the time today. Appreciate it's a tight time slot, so I'll really spend most of my time talking around the main thing, which I think is strategy and execution. But basically, as you said, Peter, so I am a chartered accountant as well. I spent sort of almost a decade across the sort of 3 tiers of the profession. So a big 4 accounting firm, a mid-tier practice, and also a boutique or smaller firm. And so when I sort of merged into this practice development world, I really looked at this as an accountant and as a professional rather than as a marketing person, and really just went for what works. And so what I've really come up with in speaking with over easily 100 professional services firms and working with over 30 of those firms is really a bottom-up strategic, no BS approach, if you like, to building a professional services firm in 2020. And what I'm really talking about really is organic growth. So, organic relative to growing a client base through acquisition. There's definitely a place for both in a practice development strategy, but in this presentation today, I'm purely focusing on that organic growth piece. And so what we're doing, and we've really broken it down into what I call the 5 Ps. So positioning or strategy, which is by far and away the most important, but then diving into the tactics. So then profile, people, prospecting, and pre-selling. And it's sort of what I've developed and called a 5 Ps framework as being a bit of a predictable method for generating leads into a practice. And I'll just quickly skip through these. These are just standard slides I have some of the clients I'm working with. This one's quite interesting, and I threw this in because it's literally just last week in the midst of a pandemic, and this particular client of mine is suffering, or their industry is suffering quite a bit with who their market is, but they're still acquiring clients. In this particular case, the conversation and dialogue was introduced through LinkedIn, a social media platform. And so, yeah, even in this current market, businesses still have problems, people still have problems, and clients are there to be won, basically, if you sort of have a bit of a strategy in place. And so the first thing I want to talk about, and the thing really I'm going to spend most of my time on, given I normally spend an hour and a half on this particular presentation, so I really want to condense it down and talk around this strategy piece. And really, this is, there's no denying it for professional services, and I call this the uncomfortable truth. And this is what a lot of marketing firms just won't directly tell you. And that's most marketing for professional services businesses, accountants, lawyers, financial planners, etc. It's actually really hard work. And the reason it's hard work is because most firms lack what I would refer to as meaningful differentiation from the rest of the marketplace. And so, a lot of firms, when they start to embark upon this practice development journey, they end up sitting in a room with their fellow partners and trying to workshop this stuff. And they end up concluding that their difference is their customer service or their website or something that really isn't that too meaningful. And really, that's just the hygiene standard of a good business. It's not really a meaningful differentiator for a professional services practice. And so ideally you want to be differentiated, if anything, through your expertise. And so there's a few ways to look at this, but the 3 that I sort of latch onto is you might have a different perspective on a certain area. And so Matthew, just to segue it back into your presentation around alternative dispute resolution, you mentioned that that's not something that every law firm's doing. And so that's an example of a different perspective that may or may not be a great strategy to pursue within the marketplace. And I'll talk about a few more case studies directly with some of my clients shortly. Alternatively, or in addition to, you might have some insights that are deeper in some areas. So perhaps just through time and experience in your client base, maybe you've developed an industry or industries specialization, and then you can go ahead and build an organic growth strategy around that. And finally, maybe it comes back to IP. So again, over time, you might have developed some tools, templates, some methodologies, etc., that might benefit a certain type of person or client base. And again, it's possible, and I'll talk to some case studies in a moment around where I've seen that succeed in the marketplace. And so, you know, some of you may appreciate that this isn't actually easy or even perhaps immediately obvious. And in my view anyway, that's why many firms don't actually pursue this. But the good news is pretty much everyone I do end up, you know, investing some time with, it does turn out that their practice does have some particular area of expertise. And if it's not at least first apparent, it's buried somewhere within the firm. And so just quickly, some case study examples of some practices I've worked with. And obviously I'm not going to disclose names as you'd appreciate, but and also with Matthew on the line, I'd like to also state that this is just general advice. So don't go away and apply any of this to your practice without first having a conversation, if not with me, but with someone else who can actually, you know, point you in the right direction and put a plan and strategy around some of this stuff. But, you know, some of the things that we have seen succeed in the marketplace, even in the COVID-19 environment, an accounting practice who has decided to entirely forego compliance work in order to pursue outsourced financial management or CFO advisory services. Another one of my clients is a financial planner who had a unique onboarding process built around cash flow modeling. And so through that IP, he'd really worked out that clients or potential clients really valued that upfront at the start of the relationship. And we were able to build an organic growth strategy around that differentiation factor. An accounting practice who is working exclusively with hospitality business owners. And so you'd appreciate the risk of adopting a strategy like that is particularly in this environment where, you know, the poor restaurants and cafes are doing it a bit tough at the moment with all the things going on. But that's an example of a depth of insight differentiation based on, you know, years of experience in working with that particular sector. A tax practitioner who has a deep understanding of tax planning, specific to medical practices. So again, depth of insight. And really, I just want to say that, like, this is nothing new, and really I haven't created or made that stuff up. You know, I think almost 30 years ago, before the internet and social media and all of this stuff came about, Mr. Meister, who I know, Peter, you're familiar with.
Yes, I knew David. Yeah, met him on a few occasions. Very nice chap.
Great, yeah. I'd like to meet him myself, but yeah. So he's obviously said a few things around this that predates much of the modern sort of technology that's out there. But he said the first thing to note is the raspberry jam rule. The broader audience you attempt to reach, the weaker is the impact. And he proposed, and I totally agree, and my experience now sort of rectifies this comment, which is, rather than paying little attention to a lot of prospects, it's always better to give more attention to a smaller, well-selected audience. And the key takeaway is you really want your practice or a certain component of your practice to have a far greater appeal and value to a smaller segment of the market. And so this is a strategy issue, not a tactics issue. So it's really important to separate the strategy. So what's our plan of action? What really makes sense for us to pursue? Separate that away from tactics, which is your website, offline tactics like networking, social media, bringing it back into the online world. And that's why I really wanted to focus, at least today, mostly on the strategy side, because I think it's the most important things for practices to get right. And so this is just one way I start to think about strategy. So you'd appreciate out in the marketplace, there's people, there's businesses that have problems, needs, and desires. And then separate to that, we've got your firm, your firm's existing background, your existing background as a principal or partner. You've got your existing client base and the learnings that have come from that. Obviously, you'll have some existing IP and some skills yourself and as well as your team. And the third variable is perhaps the skills that you can learn or that your team is keen to learn. And Peter, I know that's part of what you're doing with ESS, obviously, is providing that upskilling of accountants in terms of the ones that want to go into this sort of space. And really, one way to think about this is, your firm's organic growth opportunity, it's the intersection of those three core variables. And sometimes, you won't need to acquire additional skills. Sometimes you'll just already have it based on the runs you've already got on the board with your existing client base. But other times you will need to upskill and learn some new things, which is why, I've got that there as well. Now, by far, the most important of the factors is the market's problems, needs, and desires. And even in a COVID-19 environment where, things have been pretty much turned on their heads across many industries and things are just operating in a really strange way right now. The truism that still exists is that people still have problems, needs, and desires. And so those challenges may be slightly different to what they've been in a business as usual economy. But that still doesn't negate the fact that there are still opportunities to be solved by accountants, by lawyers, by financial planners, by any professional service provider. It's a case of sitting down and saying, well, do we want to go about solving these problems? And if so, how do we go about it? And I'll talk towards the end, Peter, around, one of the ways anyway, your subscribers or client base can get started on that journey. But I think the thing to keep in mind, just on that last point about people having problems, is no one wants what we sell. So they want their problems solved. And again, I really liked what Matthew had to say around just being commercial in trying to solve problems in the most expedient way possible, because I'm sure for many that's really what they want. And so that's something to keep in mind in this environment. It's thinking outside the box. Being willing to help people and solve their problems. And so, Peter, I don't know if you want to just pause for a bit and just allow some questions on that strategy piece. I mean, I do have a few other things to talk about, but this is by far and away, I think, the most important point before we even start to talk about the internet or online. It's making sure people understand this strategy needs to come first.
Okay, let me just check to see whether we have any questions. I can't see that we've got any. So I got a question here though, and you touched on it there before about skills and upskilling. I've been around this profession for a long time now, and it amazes me that you still hear some younger accountants, and I've had a couple of them actually working for me when they finish their PY in the Institute professional year, basically adopting the attitude that their days of studying are over. And my response has normally been, well, hang on, all you've got now is a license. You've got to continue to do these things. That's why the professional bodies impose so many hours a year in professional development. That's not a joke, it's serious. And you've only got to look at what's going on in social media and website development and some of the issues that have come out of this coronavirus to realize that there's a whole range, even learning how to use this technology we're using here now in Zoom. It's just all part of the professional journey, isn't it? That people need to be keeping abreast of.
Oh, I totally agree, Peter. And in my experience in talking to such a wide range of firms, there's a spectrum of people that have that fixed mindset, don't want to learn. And then there's those at the other end that are just keen to digest and learn as much as they can and keep abreast of this stuff. And most practices sit somewhere in the middle of that. But yeah, I definitely think, it's definitely interesting times, and where we're going is quite interesting with things, and where the technology is taking us as well is something that I think, certainly as an accounting profession, it can't be ignored. And I think we could talk for hours on that subject, Peter, because I think it's something we both have some, quite a bit of experience in. But I do think now more than ever, accountants in particular do need to think about adopting more of a growth mindset relative to just, sitting back and staying complacent and pretending like things like this aren't happening. And that goes for the younger practitioners in particular.
Yeah, and I think, you mentioned differentiation before. I think it's a great word. I think every business should be very confident that they can articulate what their differentiation is. And it's, I think, probably more important in professional service firms, because in lots of ways the market probably thinks that every accountant's the same or every lawyer's the same. Well, we know they're not. But within certain groups, they are, aren't they? Tax practitioners are very similar. How they differentiate themselves is an issue, but they can do it if they set about thinking about it, and then talking to people like you with that marketing hat on and saying, well, how do we now tell the marketplace about this point of differentiation?
Yeah.
So do you want to comment on that? Well, what should accountants be doing about differentiation? Do they just wait for 20 years to see if something emerges? Or do they set out in that first year in professional practice, even if they're going into a partnership with an established firm? I sense that's one of the mistakes that some accountants and potentially lawyers, Matthew, are making. They just think they got to fit into the groove, the model in that firm.
Yeah.
I don't think that's right. What do you want to say on that?
Yeah, I think every practice needs a plan. As they always say, failing to plan is planning to fail. And so even if you do sit it on that model of where, you're a sole practitioner and you don't necessarily want to, embrace all of this thing, the technology to its fullest extent, I still think that inherently in and of itself is a plan. And based on where that practitioner is at in their career and where that practice is at based on the existing client base, that may or may not be the appropriate plan based on where they are right now. And that's where, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I'm happy to actually talk to, sort of the first 5 people. And I've got a slide at the end, Peter, where I'm happy to talk to people. As I've said, I've spent sort of the last sort of 2 years speaking to over 100 professional services firms. And working with over 30 of them. And it always surprises me, even though you'd think that all an accountant is an accountant, honestly, like every firm I'm working with is different in some way, just because of who that person is, what their background has been, what their client base looks like, where they're located, geography. And geography can still be a great strategy, but it's just about bringing that to the surface and being conscious of the decision you're making. And so, yeah, I am happy to have conversations with people one-to-one where I think you get the most value out of really understanding where they should be. But yeah, it's something that I think just can't be ignored, and practices need a plan.
Yes, I agree. And hopefully people are taking notice of that who are watching this video.
Yeah, no problem. Well, I'll keep going, Peter, and please do cut me off because, as I said, this is generally a much longer presentation, and I'm trying to squeeze it in and give as much value as I can for your listeners.
Peter, do we have time for me to ask a question on
Matthew, please?
Yes.
Launch in.
Thank you. So, Trent, I was wondering what you think about being client focused as opposed to internally focused. Has in terms of impacting on this strategic decision?
Yeah, it's certainly a variable. I think if you were going to build a marketing strategy and plan around the point of difference of being client focused, I really think that may be suitable, but it's really got to be backed up, because pretty much everyone says, oh, we're client focused. And so if you are client focused, well, how can you prove that in the marketplace? Do you have an abundance of case studies and testimonials that say, that you're client focused as a practice? And so I think when you are trying to work out a strategy of difference, it's really got to be thinking about what does everyone say in the marketplace and what's actually truly our difference. And we, we have Peter, as I know, we have an entire process around that, around researching with our clients, around talking to client bases, etc., to really find if that's true or if that's just noise and what everyone else says. So possibly, Matthew, but we'd have to have a bit more of a chat.
No, thanks a lot, Trent.
Yeah, no worries. All right, I'll keep pressing forward, but if either of you two have any questions, please do feel free to stop me. So as I said, strategy is the number one thing, and it's the most important part to get right. And it's the part where no marketing person who's not a professional services marketer anyway will start the journey. They'll all try and talk about tactics, but I think really no tactic makes sense until you've got that strategy worked out. So let's presuppose that strategy is worked out, and now we're talking execution. And so where do we start that journey once we do have a supportable point of difference? Well, I think to guide the answer, let's consider this. Since 1999 to 2012, there's been a rapid uptick in the number of Google searches that have occurred each and every year. And I'm sure that number has continued to go past 2012. Similarly, from about 2008, there's been an explosion in the use of social media platforms. You look at the chart with Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn's done something very similar, but it's not there. And so, to get our point of difference in front of the right people, it's probably not a silly idea to think that the online world is the place to start. And, you look at your own behaviors and you look at the marketplace. If you just walk outside, you can see people consuming content, and they're consuming that content through these online mediums. And so I think for most practices with this point of difference, and again, it's going to differ depending on the firm and what the strategy ends up being. But I do think pretty much in 95% of cases, it's getting this online world right and knowing how to approach it in a way that respects the existing goodwill and reputation of the firm. That's sort of going to be the place to start. And the thing is, where do you start? I mean, I spend all of my time in this world now, and I don't even know what 80% of those badges are. So I can't blame people for being confused about all of this. And I think for just again to share some practical tips and insights, what ends up happening is they get told, in particular by other marketing people, that all of these platforms are what they need to be doing. And so they start dabbling, but pretty soon, once they try it themselves, they lose interest and the fire goes out. And I think in professional services, the 80-20 rule, keeping the main thing is important. And it's realizing that we need to have a strategy or a plan to execute our strategy, but just keeping the main thing and not trying to turn ourselves into a digital marketing type company. And so I think for most practices, in most cases, not always, but I think LinkedIn is probably going to be a core place to start the journey. And the reason I like LinkedIn, and I'm going to start speeding up, Peter, because I've got a fair bit to say, and do cut me off if we're short on time. But basically, if you were to plot, how personal the platform is and how scalable it is, and a number of business development activities that you can execute, LinkedIn is probably one of the better ones in the sense that you can get your point of difference across to the marketplace at scale, but it's also, touch wood, at least in 2020, it's still quite personal in the sense that you can start personal conversations through that platform if it's done the right way, of course. And then those can obviously escalate offline into a face-to-face conversation or a Zoom meeting. And the thing to always keep in mind is, some people are going to be happy with an existing provider. Some are going to be doing it themselves, but there's always going to be that segment of the market. It's the 1% rule that's always going to be in need of someone that needs what you have. And that's fantastic. And so just some quick tips and takeaways in terms of where to start. And I won't spend a whole bunch of time on this because I'm cognizant of time. Clients care about themselves more than anything. It comes back to having their problem solved. And so, as I think Dale Carnegie sums it up well, people aren't interested in you, they're interested in themselves, morning, noon, and after dinner. And so, what most professionals say and do and what's portrayed on their online presence is what's on the left. And don't get me wrong, that there is definitely a place for that, but I think it needs to skew slightly a little bit more to the right, which is demonstrating an understanding of the client's problem through your messaging and through your marketing approach. Demonstrating that you respect the problem and showing that you can solve those problems together. And so this is just a quick structure around what a LinkedIn profile can look like in terms of structure if you're trying to write one yourself. Profile picture, I'll skip through. It's pretty straightforward. Having some testimonials is also quite useful. And so I know I flew through that, Peter, but is there any questions on that element, or should we just keep going?
No, I haven't got any specific questions there. And Trent, if you can just go for another couple of minutes then, if that's okay.
Got it. Yeah. So I will wrap it up very quickly. So the thing again with LinkedIn is once we're targeted and we know who our ideal client is, we can use advanced tools like Sales Navigator to really drill in on who those clients are. So this is a Boolean search of certain accounting practices that fit very specific criteria. And so I could narrow it down to 3,000 of those practices who I might want to actually get connected with through the platform. And once they're connected, then I can then, sort of have an opportunity to share my content with them. And I'll keep just browsing through this. Again, something that needs to be considered is the size of any market. This is some ABS data at 2018. And the key takeaway here is, and this some people might already be aware of this, but it's really in Australia, looking at the business landscape, 20% of the businesses are doing more than $500,000 in turnover or more. And so if you are a practice that's looking at providing a certain service or leveraging a certain service that requires businesses with a budget, well then LinkedIn is a great way and has a mechanism to ensure that you're only getting in front of that particular segment of the marketplace. And so I am going to quickly just browse through this stuff because just of time. But again, the main takeaway and thing I wanted to get across really is just that strategy piece, and having an ability, I guess, to understand professional services aren't a mass business. We're acquiring clients one at a time. It's a high trust game. And so any marketing strategy or approach needs to reflect this. And so it's really all about education, giving the market an opportunity to get to know you, get to know your brand, and then ultimately having that first call or conversation offline. And so, yeah, we execute this and work with practices in a number of ways. We can actually work as almost like an outsourced marketing team for you, or we can, coach you up and upskill your existing team on an execution strategy. But as I said before, Peter, and just in summary, I really can't emphasize enough, for any firm that's out there thinking, is this for me? You really need to take a strategy first approach to this. And so I'm more than happy, as I said, Peter, to offer a personalized 60-minute one-on-one strategy session with up to the first 5 people, I guess, that come through on this thing. I only ever do 10 of these a month. So I'm happy to do 5 for your subscriber group, Peter, or anyone on the line. It's not a sales pitch. As I said, I've spoken to over 100 professional services firms, and I think that there's a lot of value that I can share with those that are really taking this seriously. And again, it's based on those 3 things. So your perspective might be different, your depth of insight might be deeper in some areas, or perhaps you've got some IP. And it comes back to that chart I keep coming back to. But yeah, if anyone is interested in that, Peter, then I'd encourage them to go to that link on the screen, go.trentdbutler.com/let's chat. There'll be a short little survey which will help me prepare for that session. I normally do a little bit of research on your firm's website. I work out what I can tell about your strategy from your current online presence, and then yeah, more than happy to dive in and share my thoughts on that call. So.
Okay, thank you very much then, Trent. And
no worries.
So that's a great offer from Trent. So log on to go.trentbutler.com/let's chat. And I'm sure Trent can give you a very good service. In fact, I know he can because I've worked with Trent, and he's very thorough and very professional. So thank you, Trent.
Thanks, Peter. Most welcome.
Okay, well, we might just move on because time's running on, and we just need to go on to the next item, and I'll just share this. So COVID update, very quickly, there's been a few changes here. Some of these, of course, have been coming up for the last few weeks, but the extension of the apprenticeship subsidy scheme was announced by the Prime Minister yesterday. It's now going to go through to the 31st of March 2021. The government is also going to establish a vocational education initiative for 300,000 school leavers and unemployed people. And this is targeted to be at the new skills that are going to be needed in the workforce. I don't know if any accountant needs reminding, but the Federal Treasurer is going to introduce an economic statement next Thursday, 23rd of July, in Parliament. And that will give us answers, hopefully, on programs like JobKeeper and JobSeeker and the other initiatives coming out of the federal government, as COVID-19, unfortunately, looks like it's going to be with us a bit longer than what we originally thought. One of the interesting articles in the Financial Review this week has been that the Bank of Mum and Dad is back. That was an article a few days ago. It's an interesting commentary, and perhaps highlights the difficulties that many of your clients are already having in securing funding for their businesses. Are mum and dad going to be able to supply all the money they're looking for? Or should you be obtaining more information on other funding opportunities that are available for businesses? Crowdsource funding, Section 708 of the Corporations Act, capital raising, and others. Another news story that I took note of was that the Institute of Company Directors has made a submission to the Treasurer for an extension of the pandemic regulatory shield to the end of the year. This is where the government made amendments, temporary amendments to the Corporations Act to defer legal action against directors for insolvent trading until the end of September, and for deferment of any legal action against companies for non-payment of loans and debts until the end of September. The Institute of Company Directors is asking that those amendments be extended until the end of December. I don't know if everyone's in other businesses is going to be in agreement with that. A reminder that the coronavirus SME guarantee loans close on the 30th of September. These are the loans that are 50% guaranteed by the federal government. The Reserve Bank made the rules when this money was made available, and any unutilized funding out of $105 billion was to be returned to the Reserve Bank at the end of September. So if you wish to try to obtain one of those grants, one of those loans, sorry, for your clients, I think you should be getting the information together now. The major banks also announced 10 days ago that they're prepared to negotiate the extension of their loan holidays that they initiated for a further 4 months. That would take it through to the end of January 2021. But the bank customer has to make an application. So it's not automatic. So your clients can't sit back and think this is automatically going to happen. The CommBank Accounting Market Pulse report that was released 2 weeks ago identified that business advisory services is expected by the accountants that they surveyed to be in the highest demand for the next 6 to 12 months. Is that how you see it in your firm? This could be part of the differentiation. perhaps you should be talking to Trent about how you're going to get that message across. And of course, you can talk to us at ESS BizTools, because we've got the tools that you could utilize to effectively deliver business advisory services. So very quickly on an action plan, I think it's the time now to be preparing strategic plans for your clients. Whether you've never done them in the past for certain clients, I don't think matters. This is going to be a horror year if we let it get that way. And many of your clients are going to need assistance. Helping your clients find their funding. Every financial writer in the Financial Review for the last 2 months has said that getting loans from banks post 30 September is going to be difficult. I think it's going to be very, very difficult. And some of your clients will be looking for money. Where are they going to go? Borrowing from friends, from mum and dad, or crowdsource funding? Think about it. We can assist you at ESS BizTools. We have products that will help you guide your clients through these processes. And you're most welcome to go to our website where you can obtain a no obligation 30-day trial. Please go to ESS BizTools to register, or we will undertake a no obligation 60-minute free webinar interview with you and your colleagues in your firms. Next week, we have our next webinar, and the presenters are myself and Nigel Abbott, who's a director of Funsition, one of the crowdsource funding intermediaries. Nigel's going to be talking about why equity crowdfunding should be on your radar. This funding channel may be perfect for your clients. And to register, please go to our website, www.essbiztools/webinars. For more information, you're most welcome to visit our websites at ESS BizTools. Stay safe. Thank you for your participation in viewing this webinar. Good luck in your firm. Matthew, thank you very much for your contribution today.
Thank you, Peter. I appreciate the opportunity of speaking to everyone.
Thank you. And Trent, thank you very much for you being with us today and giving us that overview and for that offer you've made for 5 firms to take advantage of a 60-minute overview from you. Thank you very much.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Peter. Thank you for having me.
So thank you, everyone, and good luck. Unfortunately, I think we're, in football terms, we're only at half time in this battle against COVID-19, and recent events have really proven that, and the various football codes have really been thrown in the chaos, haven't they? But good luck with everything, and we'll talk to you again next Friday. Thank you, and have a great weekend. Bye-bye. And good luck to everyone.